When it comes to false anxiety, what we really want to do is identify what's causing the physical imbalance, address it at that level, and eliminate all of this unnecessary suffering.
I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Ellen Vora. Ellen is a board-certified psychiatrist, acupuncturist, and yoga teacher. She's also the author of The Anatomy of Anxiety. So today we're going to be talking about all things mental health, but most importantly, we're going to be thinking about it through the lens of functional medicine. So what that means, we're going to really sort of dissect here with Ellen, but what's unique about her approach to psychiatry is the way she's able to look at mental health from a root cause perspective, not just think about what's the symptom, but really understand why are we experiencing that symptom and then work backwards to fix that issue. Just to highlight your incredible credentials, you received your BA from Yale University, your MD from Columbia University, and obviously you're clearly a continuous learner, having also gone after functional medicine training, written a book, you're doing all the things. So thank you so much for coming on. First of all, welcome. I want to dive deep into your book, obviously, because I think that's like the initial way in which we can start to understand how you think about mental health. I want you to, in your own words, explain how you differentiate between false anxiety and true anxiety and where you end up spending the majority of your time with patients, given that breakdown. And then we'll go from there.
Amazing. Hi. Thanks for having me, Chloe. The central thesis of my book is that we have these two types of anxiety, what I call false anxiety and true anxiety. I've learned now 3+ years into the book tour that false anxiety is a somewhat triggering term. And so we can always swap in a different word there, which is avoidable anxiety. It doesn't invalidate the very real suffering of false anxiety. This is life-altering suffering, but it doesn't have to be happening. It's avoidable. So false anxiety or avoidable anxiety is physical anxiety. It's anxiety that's generated by some state of imbalance in the physical body. And it usually happens as a result of something we don't even think of as a big deal. We might have a blood sugar crash. We had an extra cold brew coffee. We were up an hour later than our bedtime, doom scrolling. We're hungover. Something has generated a stress response in the body. And then we subjectively experience that stress response as a state of anxiety. It can even feel like panic. And when it comes to false anxiety, what we really want to do is identify what's causing the physical imbalance, address it at that level, and eliminate all of this unnecessary suffering. And then we have our true anxiety, which is fundamentally different. This is not something to fix. It's not something to suppress. We don't get to decaf coffee our way out of our true anxiety. This is not what's wrong with us. It is actually what's right with us when we are able to viscerally connect to what's wrong around us. And that can have to do with our personal lives, our communities, the world at large. But our true anxiety happens when our inner compass is tapping on our shoulder and saying, slow down, pay attention, something feels uneasy here. And it usually has a call to action baked into it. It wants us to show up and course correct and get something back into alignment. And so that's how I approach anxiety. And the second part of your question, I've actually never been asked. I think it's such a smart way to think about this, is how much time relatively do I spend in these two types of anxiety? I spend 90% of the time in false anxiety. It's the low-hanging fruit, it's the quick wins, and it's in the way. So much of what we believe is our true anxiety, it's actually false anxiety. And so that's always the place I start. And often we get somebody almost all the way to the place of relief from their anxiety just by addressing it on the level of the physical body.
Okay. I want to stop you there because I already have so many follow-up questions. So you say that the only one of the two that's avoidable is the false anxiety, but isn't technically true anxiety somewhat avoidable in that you know, the call to action is let's sort through the history. Let's sort through the trauma. Let's sort through what's happening behind the scenes that you haven't properly processed. And so technically with the right support, with the right approach, you are able to avoid that anxiety. And then the other thing that you said was, the call to action is like a visceral reaction. Do you think that false anxiety is somewhat also of a visceral reaction that exacerbates your true anxiety, or are they just completely two separate things? Like, let's say you're someone who struggles with anxiety around public speaking, and maybe that's, so is that possible that that's like a true anxiety? Give me an example of a true anxiety.
Yeah, wait, so there's so much here that I want to work through. So when we talk about trauma, you like went straight for the jugular of like where my classification system breaks down. And I acknowledge this. I think there's a paragraph in the book where I'm like, listen, the thing that doesn't lend itself to this classification is trauma. Mm-hmm. And is it true? Is it false? It doesn't belong in either category. I do think that a major source of anxiety is unresolved trauma. And I always want to add unresolved there because I deeply believe from a place of fundamental optimism about mental health that we can bring ourselves to a place of resolution with regard to our trauma. Doesn't invalidate it, doesn't negate it. It just means that it doesn't have to be driving the state of our nervous system in the here and now. And so when someone has a lot of unresolved trauma, I want them to work with a trauma-focused therapist. I want them to do treatments like EMDR, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. I want them to address the trauma at the root and then get to a place where it's not constantly keeping the foot on the gas pedal of the limbic system, making everything feel like a threat. Okay. And so it is kind of a true anxiety that can be addressed on the level of the limbic system, on the level of reprogramming the brain so that it can be avoidable. So you went straight to the fact that like, that's perfect. Like, that's very astute. And because I was like, no one's going to notice this. But you did. So an example of true anxiety. So I think you're also picking up on this other real subtlety of true anxiety, which is that, like, for example, I was recently treating a patient who had autoimmune disease. Mm-hmm. She had Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is an autoimmune condition where the body's attacking the thyroid tissue, creating a state of hypothyroidism. And this is a largely practitioner audience member, so that's only for the occasional layperson listener who needs that explanation. But basically, in her case, there was a physical material basis for this autoimmune condition. She had intestinal permeability. She had sort of the HLA types that predispose her to this. Autoimmunity ran in her family. She had had this stressor and this insult. And so it made perfect sense that she would have developed Hashimoto's. What also was an interesting part of the work we did together was that she described how growing up, she did not feel like she had access to her voice, that she didn't feel like she could express her truth, that she didn't feel worthy of getting her needs met. She didn't feel worthy of expressing her needs. And I can't help but think about how autoimmune conditions are sometimes right at that interface between something that's purely physical and something that has more of a psychospiritual dimension. The throat is the throat chakra. It has to do with our voice and our communication. And so through that belief system, this would be the exact physical location in the body where she would get out of balance. And so in that respect, there is a kind of true anxiety component to how she physically got out of balance with Hashimoto's. Public speaking is also a really good example where there's a lot of false anxiety that goes into fear of public speaking. If we're underslept, if we're overcaffeinated, if we're on again, off again with a benzodiazepine, this can generate a lot of unnecessary stress response in the body and generate false anxiety. And I think that there's often something to really address there about where somebody is feeling judged, where someone is actually often, in an interesting way, feeling judgmental. And I find so often the people that most fear judgment from others, they're actually harboring quite a lot of judgment of others. And it's almost like we project out onto others that they might be judging us just as viciously as we are judging them. And so there's a lot of false anxiety that goes into the public speaking issue. There's so much we can do to calm the nervous system and change the threshold toward panic. And there's often something to unpack there about why it feels so vulnerable. And I usually like to address it from both angles.
Okay, fair. Hi, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment to tell you a bit more about our membership. So if you're new to the Lanby, we are a modern approach to concierge medicine. We look at functional medicine, integrative medicine, longevity as modalities to really enhance primary care to be more proactive and preventive. So as a member, you're working with a dedicated care team, which includes a physician who's board certified in family medicine, but also has training in functional and integrative medicine, a wellness advisor who's a registered dietitian, so can really help you look at nutrition, sleep, exercise, supplements, all the sort of complementary modalities to elevate your approach to health. And lastly, a member advocate to help you coordinate your care and make sure everything feels seamless. So if you are looking to take more control and really support your health journey going forward, I encourage you to look at our website, thelanby.com, or book a free consult call. So I feel like because we're sort of in this phase of defining key terms, can you also explain the difference between anxiety and stress? And maybe that's only false anxiety and stress, but like, how do they manifest differently? Because when you say false anxiety and you highlight the caffeine, you highlight the glucose spikes, you highlight all these things, like it makes me think, oh, well, this person is just dealing with stress. So how do you actually differentiate the two? And as a person, as an individual, like, how can you start to self-assess those things so that, again, going back to functional medicine, you can work backwards to remove that trigger?
So I don't feel like I have a clean system for this as well. I once heard it said that worry is happening in the mind, stress is happening in the body, and then anxiety is sort of the sum total of these. But some people, stress is a subjective experience for them. They're saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling these stressors, the noun, in my life, and that's making me feel a state of stress. And I think that to me, I'm always moving away from I'm less concerned with whether someone qualifies for a diagnosis of anxiety. That's certainly my training, is to say, here are the diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, for panic disorder. And I think that's very important for clinical research. Like, we need standardization. We need to say, what are we defining here? It's also important when we are starting to talk about medication, because it is critical to gatekeep interventions that can potentially have harms. If we want to do that cost-benefit analysis of an intervention, we want to always think about, well, does this merit that kind of intervention? Is that intervention indicated here? So that's where diagnostic criteria are important. When I'm working with patients, I'm generally recommending diet and lifestyle treatments. So there isn't really anything to gatekeep. There's not really side effects. There's side benefits. The real only side effect is how much effort does it make sense for someone to put into diet and lifestyle changes. That should usually be proportional to how much they're suffering. But I usually run with whatever they're subjectively calling their state of suffering. So if someone feels more comfortable saying, I'm someone who has a lot of stress, I'm stressed, then I feel like that's a term that they've latched onto because they feel that they have cultural permission to be stressed, and that's what they're pointing to and saying, here's how I'm suffering. I have other patients who the word anxiety feels so like they're latched onto that. And I think culturally, societally, it's interesting to look at who feels that they have permission to say, I'm anxious. It tends to be younger generations more than older generations. It tends to be, in the older generations, women more than men. And I think that that's equalizing in younger generations. And so I'm not really here to push back on whatever term someone's identifying with. I'm sort of interested in getting them relief regardless. And I don't see those two, like anxiety versus stress, as necessarily meaning that we do anything different. Like, it doesn't change management for me. I'm still hearing that their body is getting tripped into a stress response. This is generating something that could be called stress, could be called anxiety. It's creating suffering, and it's something we can address. And so I sort of move away from the terms. That was a long-winded answer.
No, I think that's fair. I think some people say, again, to your point of how they describe it, like, I suffer from anxiety. And it's like, I'm more prone to anxiety. Like, I feel it in my body, like my heart's palpitating and I don't necessarily know why. I just all of a sudden feel anxious. whereas stress, I think actually most people don't even realize that they're stressed. And it's through other physical manifestations that they start to realize like, oh, maybe it's because I'm stressed. Like, oh, my skin is breaking out, or, oh, my hormone levels are low, or, oh, I'm not sleeping well. Is it basically the same thing? It's just like one, I don't know. I don't know if there's like a sort of point of this question, to your point, like, why are we even talking about this? I wonder why we even came up with these two words.
I could nerd out all day on these semantics. And I think that cortisol is, like our stress hormone cortisol, is a unifying characteristic of both when we say like, oh, I'm breaking out, maybe I'm just stressed, and false anxiety. So when we're breaking out, when we're stressed, when we have IBS because we're chronically stressed, cortisol is certainly playing a role in both of those. With the breakouts, partly in how it's suppressing our immune system, partly in how it's impacting our progesterone manufacturing in the adrenal glands. It's doing, or not directly in the adrenals, but how we're taking the mutual precursor pregnenolone and putting it toward making stress hormone and not having enough left over to make sufficient progesterone. So stress is directly impacting hormones, is directly impacting immunity, is directly impacting gut function. And therefore, sometimes we're just like, I'm breaking out. And is it because of stress? But I think cortisol is playing a central role in false anxiety as well. And it's these seemingly innocuous aspects of modern life, like when our blood sugar is swinging wildly on a roller coaster. When our blood sugar crashes, then that generates a stress response in the body. That's a release of adrenaline and cortisol. And it's the design of the human body to say, hey, we really need to get a meal or else we're going to be in trouble. So it creates urgency. That's also the cue to the liver to break down the glycogen that it's storing. So it's a decent design. It just happens to have as the side effect that we feel anxious and sometimes even panicked. And to me, the way this all changes management is to understand that these aspects of modern life that trip our body into imbalance, make our body secrete cortisol. We experience that as anxiety, but what we really want to do is prevent that stress response in the first place. And how do we do that is the real question.
So it sounds like your approach when it comes to the false anxiety is remove the stressors, but then from a psychiatry perspective, are you also helping them find those mechanisms to not react to those stressors? Like I'm still struggling with the difference, honestly, between the false and the true anxiety, because it feels to me like the reason why we succumb to false anxiety is because we don't have the right tools to deal with what's actually beneath the surface. And so it's just exacerbating what's beneath the surface. But like, even if you do clear out the triggers, you're still left with true anxiety. Or are you saying that people without true anxiety still can experience false anxiety?
Very much so, the latter. Yeah. So I wouldn't even call it remove the stressors, because to me, the connotation of remove the stressors is like you have a toxic boss. Let's remove that stressor. And there's a time and a place to get out of a toxic workplace for sure. But I'm saying that we even can be more physiologically resilient, even in the face of our very real stressors in our lives, that we don't ever really get to the point where we have perfectly fixed the stressors in our lives. It never goes away, but we need to be able to not feel so anxious in our day-to-day lives in spite of that. So it's not really remove the stressors. It's basically saying with false anxiety, it's this physical imbalance. It's that our blood sugar is crashing. It's that we're over-caffeinated, that we're undernourished, that we might be missing certain critical micronutrients, like we might not have enough vitamin B12 or folate or vitamin D or magnesium, that we're chronically underslept for a variety of reasons. Could be habits, could be obstructive sleep apnea, that we're inflamed. And we know that the degree to which we have cytokines or inflammatory molecules coursing through our bloodstream correlates with levels of depression in some people. So that's coursing through our bloodstream. It's in our brain. It's communicating with the amygdala, and it's communicating to the brain that we're under threat. So all of these states of physical imbalance, from blood sugar to inflammation, gut health issues, they are directly contributing to our anxiety levels. So where I want to start with patients is getting their physical body in balance. And it really actually doesn't even require that we get them out of the toxic workplace. That's a longer term goal, those stressors that we'd love to eliminate from our lives. But it starts with how we're feeding ourselves, how we're sleeping, how we're moving our bodies, the health of our digestive tract and our immune system, that's where we start, because we can often get someone to a place of being so physiologically imbalanced that they're resilient, even though there are still stressors in their lives.
Okay, so follow-up question to the sort of imbalance point is, do you see more false anxiety present itself in men or women? And part of the reason that I'm wondering this is because obviously women go through so many hormonal fluctuations, whether it's during, pregnancy, postpartum, then perimenopause and menopause. So I feel like our bodies are in constant imbalance.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do think that women are generally better at taking care of themselves than men. Maybe that's a bold statement.
I agree.
So I'm curious if it evens itself out, or what do you see?
Yeah. So I think we all have a lot. I do tend to believe that women have more false anxiety. And I think it has to do with the fact that even though, and I agree with that bold statement, that we take better care of ourselves. I mean, we have data to point to the fact that in a heterosexual marriage, the man lives longer than he otherwise would. The woman lives less long. Like we have all of these ways of saying, hey, I know how to make a meal for myself. I know how to keep my home neat. I think that we still have way more exposures. We have way more pressures on us. And then the hormonal piece itself is its own whole senior thesis, because we have to contend with the issues of contraception, or many of us do. And so that is right there, such a common source of false anxiety is women taking exogenous hormones. And I have far too many instances in my practice where a woman came in and her long-standing diagnoses are things like generalized anxiety. She might have major depressive disorder or dysthymia. Maybe there's also ADHD. We sort of piece through her history. She's already medicated. I'm thinking, how do I optimize this medication regimen? How do I support her with diet, lifestyle? And it's not until I go back to the chronology of her mental health history and I'm like, remind me, when did this all start? And she'll be like, oh, sophomore year of college. And then remind me, when did you first go on the pill? Like, yeah, fall of my sophomore year. Like I've seen that pattern far too many times to ignore. And we didn't used to have the data. It used to be that a woman would go back to her primary care doctor or her gynecologist and say, hey, since I started this pill, it seems like I'm crying every day. And they used to say, there's no evidence for that. You seem stressed. And now there is evidence for that. We now know that exogenous hormones impact mood and anxiety levels because, of course, like anybody who's ever experienced PMS, we know that hormones impact our mood. The hormonal piece is an enormous contributor. And I think there's a really interesting piece of hormones, which is what we would call PMS phase of the cycle, the late luteal phase, which is kind of this other interface between, is that false anxiety, is that true anxiety? I think that we get a bad rap, and where the world has a lot of choice expletives to describe a woman in that phase of her cycle, really that's not necessarily someone being irrational. In many ways, that's a woman with a decreased tolerance for BS. The world doesn't tolerate that very well, but that's often what's happening. But I do think a lot of us have an exaggerated state of PMS, and that has to do with our exposures. We're exposed to all of these endocrine disruptors and xenoestrogens coming through in the form of plastics and pesticides and pharmaceuticals and personal care products and cleaning products and all of that. So we have this sort of altered, oddly high estrogen level, and a lot of us are chronically stressed and undernourished. So we have sort of falsely lowered progesterone levels, and that gradient causes a more exaggerated PMS response. So in that sense, like, I give women a pass. I think that what we're mad about in the luteal phase is valid. And I think a lot of us have a very exaggerated state of discomfort, mood changes, often even can be panic, insomnia, can be dark thoughts in the luteal phase. And I think that's a false mood.
So then on the flip side of that, when a woman is going through menopause, or actually let's even take a step back before that, which is perimenopause, where the hormones are fluctuating so much, how do you support a woman through that? Because, I mean, there's definitely a lot of data to show that women that are going through this deal with more depression. I don't know if it's depression and anxiety, but I definitely hear a lot about depression. So how do you, and again, like, maybe we can even sort of take a beat and say, how do our anxiety or false anxiety and depression related? Because from what I understand about depression, it sounds like that's also a chemical imbalance in our bodies and not necessarily an emotional, spiritual deficiency or issue. So how do you think about all of that?
Yeah. Let me answer that second part in a second and sort of talk about how do I work with someone in perimenopause with hormonal fluctuations. Maybe she's having trouble sleeping, especially in her luteal phase. Maybe she's feeling newly anxious, newly depressed, a little out of her mind, brain fog. There's a lot that comes with it. Joint pains, genitourinary symptoms, decreased libido, decreased vaginal lubrication, and. To me, I'm always still going to start with all the same diet and lifestyle supports. We're still going to get someone's sleep locked in. We're going to make sure they're nourished, make sure we're having movement in a realistic way. All of that still matters. It's the foundation. But I always want to validate the fact that that is necessary, not sufficient. So if a woman is doing all of that, A+ student, and still suffering, I don't want her to feel like, am I doing it wrong? Or like this wasn't worth it, or this doesn't work. It's a necessary foundation. It's not sufficient to overcome the more lion's share impact of hormonal changes. They will eclipse the benefit of diet and lifestyle changes. And so then it's about, I think of it as like I'm driving a manual transmission, playing with those hormones. So at first, it's gentle support. I love herbs like Vitex, chasteberry, in the luteal phase to support the waning progesterone levels in the perimenopausal years. Just a little gentle support to help with progesterone so that that woman can sleep again in the luteal phase of her cycle. Then there's going to come a point where her cycle is more irregular, where maybe she's starting to have hot flashes. And that's where we might begin a process of evaluating for supplements or pharmaceutical HRT. And it all just depends on her symptoms, her personal history, all of the different considerations. But then at that point, we're basically managing in a very carefully titrated cost-benefit analysis. Here's how symptomatic you are. Here's what that points to in terms of what's the hormonal deficiency. And sometimes it's as much as just vaginal estrogen. And sometimes it's a full court press of estrogen and progesterone and intravaginal estrogen and sometimes testosterone and sometimes DHEA. And it can be a lot of different things, but we're supporting the hormones as we go. But I don't ever want to be too early or too late with that intervention. And I think that if a woman is still cycling relatively regularly, not yet having hot flashes, you don't kind of want to come at that with all the big guns blazing just yet. And I like to support it gently ramping up, but also not waiting too late, because our data also shows us that when we wait too late, the benefits, the cognitive benefits, the cardiovascular benefits of estrogen, then we sort of miss that window. And also we just don't want to wait too late so that people are suffering.
100%. And I think going back to the diet and lifestyle piece, one of the things we talk a lot about with our female patients is the importance of being proactive before you enter perimenopause, because that's when you can really build up your resilience. That adrenal support makes such a huge difference. Then when you do enter perimenopause, you have that built-in strength to withstand the fluctuations, and your body's less likely to respond negatively to that volatility. I think diet and lifestyle is not only in this situation seen as like a first line of defense, but it's really that proactive approach to mitigating those symptoms to begin with. And I think too often we don't even think about that in our late 30s because we're just recovering from like having years of postpartum. For those people who are going through that, it's like, just give me a break. But it's like we're like literally from the moment you start trying to conceive, you're literally working on your hormones. It's like the buzzword for women at this point, but it's just it's so crucial to remember that there is so much in our control in the day-to-day without the need for pharmaceuticals to build up that reserve and that resilience. And I think we sometimes overlook that and just say, oh, I'll wait till later.
That's right. And some of the data that isn't really the most front and center data that's buzzing around these days is old data from the 90s, where we looked at how people experience their menopausal years in different cultures and different regions around the world. And like I remember Japanese women having an easier menopause, and there were theories on, is it the phytoestrogens and all the soy that's consumed? Is it the fact that they are just starting from a healthier baseline in the first place? all the way to, is it that there is more of a cultural celebration of our elders and of wisdom? Because that matters too. When women feel like, okay, now I'm perimenopausal or postmenopausal, I feel invisible culturally, I feel dismissed culturally, and that will have an influence on how we navigate those years and even how we're suffering physically. It all pertains. And so, but I think you're exactly right. We don't want to turn to the diet and lifestyle reactively once we're already suffering. If we can prophylactically build that resilient foundation, it helps us, and we're less symptomatic as we enter those years.
It's crazy because I feel like we talked about this a lot when we first met. It's like the role of primary care in all of this. And obviously, if you look at traditional primary care, well, there's no role at all because they're not even talking to patients about diet and lifestyle. They're almost dismissing the symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. But let's say we talk about the utopic version of primary care. What does that look like? Where does that, fit into this sort of landscape of evolving hormones, evolving stressors, evolving everything? And, when you take that functional medicine approach, it's not necessarily only about let's figure out the root cause of your current symptoms. It's let's use that same methodology to help boost your inner reserves so that, going through the next stages of your life, you're in the best position to thrive. And that, that's really where I hope primary care lands, and why, I think from even a mental health perspective, like primary care is really that umbrella across mental, physical well-being. And I just wish there were more synergies taking place between all of these different disciplines. But anyway, that's another rant. So starting going back into like your diagnostic approach, because I'm really curious when you first see a new patient and they're coming to you being like, what is it that they're normally saying? Is it that I'm in a state of crisis and I need you to throw the kitchen sink at me? Let's try diet and lifestyle, but let's also try medicine at the same time because I need to feel relief? Or are people coming to you, more proactively and saying like, I can give this time. I sort of want to be approaching this holistically, and I'm willing to sort of do the work over the next, 6 months to a year before I even entertain the idea of medication?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it all over the years, and it has depended a little bit on sort of physically where I'm practicing in that moment. When I used to work in a conventional primary care setting, someone would come in and basically be like, okay, I want Adderall for my ADHD. And I'd be like, uh-oh, you didn't realize you were about to get an earful about diet and lifestyle and how you're breathing through your mouth while you sleep is making you more symptomatic with your ADHD. Like, people weren't looking for that.
Right.
They got it whether they liked it or not. There was a point when there's just currently not enough psychiatrists practicing with a functional medicine lens. And so I had a really long wait list. And so in that phase of my practice, anyone who made it through every hoop to see me, who had basically like written a college application to get in, then it was someone saying, I desperately want to take a holistic approach to this. The meds haven't worked for me, or I don't tolerate them, or they worked and then they stopped working. Or often what I saw was, and I'll say two things here. One is my ideal place to intervene is someone saying, hey, I'm like I've been feeling anxious. I've been feeling depressed. I'm considering my options. And should I start the medication? Should I try diet and lifestyle? Should I start them both simultaneously? To me, that is the juiciest place to begin, because it is easier to address these issues holistically before medication is in the picture. But I want them working with someone who's keeping an eye on when is it the right time to say, no, let's add the medication in. And so, but it's a lot cleaner to do that process before the medication is contributing and someone's in interdose withdrawal. What I have had as a chief complaint very often is someone saying, I've been trying to get off of a psychiatric medication for whatever reason, and they've struggled with that and have not found any support. There's very little education in our training about how to help someone taper off. There is a lot of dismissiveness around the fact that people even have a withdrawal syndrome. We now have the evidence to say, no, indeed, there is a SSRI discontinuation syndrome. It impacts, I think, nearly a majority of people getting off of psychiatric medications. So we're only now acknowledging that, and we're still at the absolute very early days of people having evidence-based protocols for supporting it. But I've had that as the chief complaint very often is I'm stuck and I try to get off of it. I can't tolerate the withdrawal. Help me get through this. And so that's been a big focus of my practice for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that by the time they join your wait list, they are looking for that support to avoid the medication. And then probably by the time they get off the wait list, they're already deep into the medication. They're like, get me off of this. Right. So I think you're right. I think there is such a shortage of people like you to help navigate the decisions around holistic. And when I say holistic, I do think sometimes that does involve medication. It's just like, how do you figure out the right balance and make sure that someone's sort of appropriately, tracking and trying to wean you off of them? When do you think is the right time to introduce medications? Or like, what's your stance on how long you put someone on it before you're like, okay, I think we're ready to wean you off?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're exactly right that holistic does not mean medications aren't in the picture. I always think about healing as this mountain, and my training taught me that there's these like two paths up the mountain: medication, psychotherapy. And the top to get to the summit of the mountain is to feel well, to be thriving in your life. And for some people, like that's the path. They hike, they get there, and great. And that's a victory. And then what I find is like many of my patients start the hike up those paths. They get only so far, and then they're sort of sliding back down the mountain. And so it's at that point that I think my field has done the world a disservice to say, nope, that's the menu. It's meds and psychotherapy. There are so many other paths up this mountain. And so my role, I feel like, is always to almost be like a hiking guide. I'm kind of like, I think I see the trail. I think it's over there. And sometimes we find our way back to the path that was that original meds and psychotherapy. Sometimes that's the right path for another phase of the treatment. If I'm being brutally honest about like how I really think about when is that the right path, for me, that path is built on a narrative about mental health, which says if we have depression or anxiety, it's the result of a genetic chemical imbalance. It says it's our brain chemistry, it's our serotonin, it's happening right in here. And that's a narrative. It's not robustly supported by the medical evidence. In fact, an umbrella review of all serotonin research related to depression was published in Molecular Psychiatry in, I think, February 2022 by Mark Horowitz. It basically showed that there is no basis for the serotonin theory of depression. That does not mean these meds aren't helping. It just means that might not be this perfectly straightforward mechanism for how they help. So if someone is listening right now, they take a medication, it's helping them. We don't need to second guess that. If something's helping you, it's helping you. We should be honest about the fact that we might not fully understand why it's helping you. And there's a lot that goes into that. Maybe a little bit of changing. I think of it as shaking up the snow globe, almost akin to how psychedelics work. There's a way that it changes patterns. So if we're entrenched and stuck in a certain way, it can switch things up. It can modulate how our stress response is behaving. It probably has downstream effects that are unrelated to serotonin. There is a placebo suggestibility component, which we know from the research, which shows that in mild to moderate depression, antidepressants don't separate from placebo. But that doesn't mean that's not a good benefit. Like placebo is pretty darn good. This is about a 30% benefit. But I'm much more comfortable recommending a placebo that doesn't have side effects. And so where I think it's indicated is that when I'm starting with a patient, I'm not operating under the assumption that they have a genetic chemical imbalance. To me, anything happening with serotonin is a downstream effect. I'm operating under the assumption that there's some underlying root cause of their depression or their anxiety. Is it physical imbalance? Is it micronutrient deficiency? Is it chronic sleep deprivation? Is it inflammation? Is it something off with the digestive tract? And is it hormone imbalance? Or is it something psychospiritual? Is it unresolved trauma? Is it a lack of community? Is it a lack of meaning and purpose in life? Do they not feel that what they do matters or that they're making a meaningful contribution? Do they just need music and nature in their life? Are they just struggling against late-stage capitalism? Whatever it is, I'm interested in identifying that true root cause and addressing it at that level. And to me, the serotonin imbalance is never the true root cause. Where I do think medication is indicated, it's not just that is someone so severe or so unsafe that I would reach for medication. That's actually not how I approach it. It's, does someone have such a strong belief that medication is what they need? Then I actually want to leverage that belief, because that belief is important. It's powerful. And if someone is in some state of subacute withdrawal from medication, sometimes medication is the only thing that will restabilize them and get them to a place where we can do all of this holistic work to get them resilient. And then we can reapproach the question of tapering off gradually.
Do you think that everyone should aim to taper off gradually, or if it's working, don't mess with it?
Yeah, if it's working and it's not causing any suffering, it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't think that there's some moral imperative to taper off of psychiatric medications. I only make myself available for that if someone is saying, I want to get off of this, and they have their reasons.
But what is the reason? What is the reason? Like, do you validate that reason to get off it? Because I think most people, when they say, I want to get off it, it's like this, again, this holistic mentality of, I don't want to be on medication. Like, I don't want to be addicted to something. I want to be able to live independently. I want to feel like my body is strong. My mind is strong. But do you think that, I guess, your belief is that it's not a chemical imbalance necessarily, and so technically everyone should be able to reach that point?
You know, if someone wants to taper just because they think philosophically it's better to be all natural or clean or something like that, like, I'm not going to co-sign that stigma of medication. I think if somebody is suffering in any way from the medication, it makes them feel not like themselves. They feel blunted. They feel less motivated or less creative. It affects their sleep. It's creating the need for another medication. It's affecting their sex drive. It's affecting their digestion. If they have like a family planning reason or a contraindication with another medication. The one subtle thing that I think is maybe worth pointing out is that a lot of my patients who want to get off of their meds, part of the reason they want to get off their meds is that the medication is creating interdose withdrawal. So a state of relative withdrawal in between doses. I'll see this with someone who's taking their SSRI in the morning. They'll wake up in a panic already. Their heart is racing, their thoughts are racing. Everything feels doom and gloom right off the bat upon opening their eyes. I think of that as someone who's probably a rapid metabolizer, and they're already at a meaningful pharmacologic nadir or low point before they've taken their morning Lexapro. And so that's impacting their quality of life. And it's not even saying that the Lexapro is not helping. It's just that daily interdose withdrawal is pretty destabilizing. With the benzodiazepines like Xanax and Ativan, Klonopin, I see this in a really pronounced way in some of my patients where they're on almost a roller coaster, and they'll take their Ativan and that feels good, but then later that day or the next day or in the middle of the night that night, they're pretty acutely anxious, irritable, uncomfortable. And that I do believe is their body coming down from the Ativan, and that's taking it as prescribed. And so it's for people who do have that sensitivity to the benzodiazepines, it's usually an indication that they might be overall less mentally fragile, more stable off of the medication. And that's not always an easy path, but I think we just need more public awareness of the fact that interdose withdrawal, not just like you went cold turkey off this med or your medication non-adherent or you forgot to refill, just taking it as prescribed, you can still be in a state of relative withdrawal in between doses, and that might be destabilizing.
That's a great point. So I want to quickly touch on psychedelics because I feel like you will have some insightful thoughts here. I feel like more and more I'm hearing about this. Like, I think more people are open-minded to doing a psychedelic journey, and they're doing it with clinical supervision, which is amazing. And they don't necessarily have a specific trauma that they're going in with, but they just have heard that this is eye-opening and this is going to sort of allow them to reach a new dimension of self-awareness, and who knows what that will unfold in terms of, you know, the insights that they gather and how it affects the rest of their lives. And it's all very positive. And then I feel like there's another camp of people that are like, why would you do that? Why would you alter your brain chemistry? This sounds so dangerous. Like, why would you put something in your body that you're going to feel out of control? And, maybe it's a good thing to keep Pandora's box closed. Like, maybe there's a reason why our body has shielded us from that trauma. Why would you process it? And also, like, if you're happy, why are you going to sort of create this volatile, experience in your life and just like totally just bomb your life?
Yeah. So, I mean, asking for a friend. I think that I do think that, like, if a person is not interested in taking a psychedelic, they don't have to. Like, it's not this box that everyone should check. It's not like, well, you're not fully like, cool or open or living an examined life unless you've done this. I think that I truly don't believe I can ever answer the question for anybody else about like if they should or when they should. I'm constantly navigating this question with my patients. I think of myself as the quarterback that's kind of saying like, when did this person just when did something go off in my mind that psychedelics are now indicated? And that happens.
But are you seeing that more psychiatrists are open-minded to psychedelics? Because I remember, like, especially in the early days of launching the Lanby, it was like we would either refer you to a psychiatrist that was pro psychedelics because you were interested in it and you wanted that, or you wanted a more traditional approach. And I would say the majority of psychiatrists at that time were anti-psychedelics or just did not know enough about it to feel like they could quarterback.
Yeah. I mean, this is like such a truism with doctors. Like, when we don't know about something, we're kind of a no to it. We're like, that's why would that? And then as it becomes more of a consensus and more of accepted, and we start to see patients who are like, well, if you won't help me, I'll go find this somewhere else. And then they go and then they come back and they say like, just by the way, here's the follow-up, is that was helpful. So that's how we learn reluctantly. And I do think that there's more openness. Our field is in crisis, whether we admit it or not. Our treatments have very variable efficacy. And when it works, it's a victory. And then there's all these millions of people for whom our current treatments are not bringing them adequate relief. Our mental health epidemic is only getting worse, not better. And now we have sort of the youth coming of age, and they've had the social media exposure, and adolescent females are in such a tough spot. So like, we need better treatments. And yesterday. And so that's where I think the field of psychedelic science is really promising. Is it perfect? Nope. Does it have risks? Of course, everything does. But I don't think that we can afford to ignore the very promising evidence that's coming out of it. We know that ketamine for treatment-resistant depression can be a beautiful unlock. It can be helpful for suicidality, which just about almost nothing that I can prescribe is actually helpful for suicidality. Some things are hurtful for suicidality. The one thing, at least when I did my training, was like lithium for bipolar. But everything else, like, we're not actually helping people with their suicidality with our medications. And ketamine can be helpful, especially in acute crisis. And that's a really needed indication. And then, of course, PTSD is this wildly unsupported diagnosis. And then we're talking about veterans. We're talking about sexual abuse survivors. There's just so much PTSD, and we are very ineffective at helping someone find genuine relief. And the fact that MDMA can bring somebody relief is like, we should be halting traffic and just saying like, this, we need to pay attention to this. It has its downsides. It has its risks, but we need to keep pursuing it. We need to answer those questions. We need to do more clinical research so that we have at least this tool in our armamentarium so that more people can get the relief they very much need. But I don't think that in our communities, nobody needs to feel pushed to do psychedelic.
No, of course. It's more the people who want to do them feeling judged or feeling like they don't have the support from their communities to do it. And I think that's where the struggle is in terms of the two schools of thought. But I know we're almost out of time. So I have one final question. If you were to leave the audience with 3 practical tips in dealing with anxiety, what would those be?
So I would want someone to prioritize good sleep. And the real way to go about that is, I think more than anything, light. It's to make sure you're getting actual sunshine into your actual eyeballs first thing in the morning, not through sunglasses or a car windshield or a window, but the real thing. And then after sunset, not seeing blue spectrum light, which is very much easier said than done in modern life. But that can mean that you're getting things down to no screens and dim lights, or maybe you're actually wearing orange plastic glasses, like I have them right here, something like this, so that our screens are not suppressing our melatonin, so we can still get tired at night. And then I want patients with anxiety to keep their blood sugar stable. That is life altering for so many of my patients. Yes. And so we need to know what throws us off, and then taking steps to stabilize. And it can be anchoring meals with protein and more healthy fats. It can be avoiding refined carbohydrates and added sugars. It can mean, a lot of my patients who refuse to make big sweeping changes, I'm like, hey, we meet you where you're at. And often it's just having a jar of almond butter on your desk and taking a spoonful of that in a pinch to give yourself stable blood sugar. I had a patient I always think about who would have panic attacks on her commute home. I had this little sneaky suspicion that that was a blood sugar issue. We just had her take a spoonful of almond butter before she left the office. No more panic attacks.
Wow.
It's just a blood sugar issue. It's manageable. And that was untold amounts of suffering in her life that was addressed through blood sugar. And the third one is community, which probably matters more than anything else we've talked about. But we're social creatures. This is because on that savanna, we were not the fastest species. We were not the strongest species. We're the ones who figured out how to cooperate. And that's really the only reason we survived. And for this reason, we're social creatures. It's in our DNA that when we feel a sense of belonging and connection, we feel safe. And when we feel disconnected or isolated or ostracized, we feel like it's a matter of life or death. And so that triggers our stress response. And that's what life is actually about. It's the quality of our relationships. And so we want to prioritize that above everything else. It's not as easy to prescribe as a spoonful of almond butter, but
no,
we
it's
want to
definitely
prioritize
not.
this. It's hard to do. And we all work too much and we're all busy. And yet, can we keep envisioning, like you said, the utopian view of primary care? Like I share that view. And I also have a utopian view of, is there a world in which we keep thinking, well, how can I do my job and see my friends and have community and exercise and eat well and be present with my kids and get enough sleep? And it's impossible. And I think if there's any vertical that could we realistically chip away at is, can our world be structured for us to work fewer hours so that we actually have the time to orient our lives around community, but also get enough sleep? And I think in this moment, this precipice with AI, like this is, who knows? And there's probably going to be a lot of good and a lot of bad that comes out of this. But I wonder if we can envision a utopian world where we do get to orient our lives around community.
Yeah. Next conversation will be all about community, I promise. Because there's so much that I learned from talking to you that one time that I was like, oh, I need that in my life. But I'll save that for next time. Okay. So I know you're working on a new book. So where can people keep track of you, follow you, learn more about what you do, access you despite this wait list? What's the best way to stay in touch with you?
So the place where I'm active is Instagram, and I'm at Ellen Vora MD. And then my first book, The Anatomy of Anxiety, is like my whole life's work in 250 pages. And then I'm currently writing my second book, which is called The Season of the Witch, which is really different. And that one comes out June of 2026.
I'm so excited. Going to be amazing. Well, thank you, Ellen. This was amazing. Again, I knew that I would not even get through half of my questions, but hopefully our audience learned a lot about anxiety and also just the triggers, because I think more than anything, it's really about identifying the sources, and that allows us to prevent them from happening more and more, and just the possibilities of how we approach treatment. So thank you so much for all of your insights, and look forward to having you back soon.
Chloe, thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Get Well Better by the Lanby. Your support truly means the world to us. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at the Lanby for behind the scenes content and updates. We would not be able to grow without your support and referrals. So please send this podcast to a friend, a loved one, anyone who you think is interested in learning more about health and wellness and navigating this maze of an industry.